Good morning. Yes, it's good morning. Good morning, everyone. Excellent, we're on. Thank you. Firstly, thank you for inviting me, Joel. Thank you. I mean, when we first had a discussion about, attending, I thought, are you sure you want me to attend? I don't know very much about culture. I don't know very much about strategy. I just do things because I feel they need to be done. So I'm not an expert. So what I'm going to do, actually, is share with you. I've been in post for exactly 13 months. So what I'm going to do is to share with you my journey over this last 13 months that has led to the creation of a new strategy yesterday. But in doing that, the question is, how can you develop a strategy that actually begins to force a change in culture? And that's the approach that we've taken. So on that note, I'll start. Just to say that my reflections are in no way a judgment of my predecessor or the previous management before I took over the university. Every university evolves and is at a particular stage during its evolution, and managers or leaders make decisions based on what is before them. So what I say is in no way a reflection of the previous management. We've heard a lot about this already, and I have a lot to say to David, actually, outside this. The key thing is the frozen fees and the pressure on unit of resource. I mean, it's fantastic from my point of view that the Labour government has actually made a change, and actually £285 is really a positive step for me in the right direction. I think very, very encouraged with the way the Labour government has been engaging with the sector, so it's real positive. Yes, the fees is an increase for 1 year, but we're hopeful. Certainly a better position than we were with the previous government. Having said that, Rachel's budget took on, they gave with one hand and took with the other, with the NI increased contributions, which for my institution is a £3 million plus increase in staff budget. And £285 goes some way to cover that, but not all of it. The migration numbers has been spoken about. I'm not going to speak much about that. The financial strain and the pressures that we're all facing. My university hasn't gone into a voluntary severance scheme as yet. We hope not to. We have been lucky and very aggressive with recruitment this year. But there's a limit to how far you can keep pushing. At some point, we all have to look at our structures and our staffing base. Non-pay costs, I think we've squeezed most of it already. I'm not sure there's much more to be squeezed, but happy to have that discussion. But ultimately, it's about staff morale. Because your best laid plans, without colleagues engaged and believing in the mission and vision of the university, it's just not going to happen. So within this context, how do you then, as a new leader, a new vice-chancellor at the university, begin to find a way to boost morale, to energize, to find ways of defining a new mission, a new vision that people can buy into? But you can only do that by firstly looking at the context. What have I done? Sorry. Great. Just to give some context about my university, just very briefly. We're now 33,000 students, over 4,500 staff. Critically, nearly 70% of our students are from the West Midlands. They commute. So we have a kind of a captured market in our area of the East and West Midlands. 44% of our students are IMD Quintile 1. And if you added IMD Quintile 2, it's nearly 60% of my students come from the most socially, economically deprived regions in the country. We're minority ethnic majority student cohort. This year, 54% of my students are first in family to go to university. We are very much about social mobility. I think I'll stop there and move on. Okay, so what's the context? Exactly 12 months ago, I arrived as new vice-chancellor. having read all the documentation that was provided to you by the headhunters, by the university, you go through all of that, you think, oh, that makes sense, that doesn't make sense, oh, I could do some changes there, metrics don't look too strong there. Right. When you arrive, it all absolutely becomes irrelevant. It does, and what actually does matter is the people and their culture, and how they work and their behaviors. So, as a new Vice-Chancellor, I set out to meet every unit, every college, every PS professional services group in small groups, about 36 meetings arranged over a few months, couple of months. And as I began to talk to my colleagues, it was absolutely very clear there was no alignment with their activities and the university strategy that was developed in 2020. So when you ask questions, oh, but why are you doing this when it says this? It doesn't matter. So that strategy that had been developed was very much on the shelf, literally on the shelf. But that in itself caused problems because every decision, because there wasn't clarity on what was expected and what we should be doing, every decision went all the way to the Vice-Chancellor's office. Even, again, anyway, it is what it is. Even requests for going to a conference went to the Vice-Chancellor's office. So you can see already the level of disempowerment. And that, for me, spoke to a disjoint between the strategy and the buy-in for that strategy with what was actually happening. The previous strategy was very much top-down. It was developed at the top level, executive level and above, and just imposed. One idea, we're a post-92, traditional post-92. Research is important, but really we're teaching intensive. One idea was to move towards a more research-focused institution. But when you impose that on a community that's very much focused on teaching and teaching intensive, you begin to create fractions already about their value and worth as academic colleagues doing the hard graft of teaching 30,000 students. So you begin to see the culture then begins to become one of, well, it's them and us. They're the favored group. It becomes very toxic. So there's no alignment, there's no focus on moving towards addressing issues that actually are important to our students first and foremost. There was then a distrust of management because they're doing this and we don't agree with that. But ultimately, the teams, the senior teams, were completely disempowered. And that is why a simple request or risk assessment about just going to a conference had to go all the way to the top. There was no accountability. And clearly, if a strategy is being put to one side and colleagues are just doing what they want to do or what they think they need to do, who's holding who to account? Where's the thread that links up the objectives of a university based on its strategy with activity and with the culture to help deliver that strategy? So that begins to provide a kind of local context. And I picked this up very, very quickly. And, you might hear from one group, but you want to kind of make sure you hear the same from a different group. But when you hear from all the groups and they're saying all the same thing, you know clearly that there's something quite wrong. So, in my engagements at the very early start, as a leader, you go in, you have some ideas, you very much think about what's going to be your vision. And colleagues and staff want to hear from you, want to hear what's your thinking about the future. The strategy that was there before I arrived was going to end in 2025. So colleagues begin to ask, you're a new person, where do you see us going? So very clearly, at the early stage, I was asking colleagues, what is our USP? What's different from the other 5 universities in Birmingham? What's our differentiator? And everybody, the majority of colleagues said, We are the University for Birmingham. And my question or my provocation to colleagues was, well, okay, great. What does that mean? Oh. And there was a bit of this, a bit of that. Well, we educate all our students from the West Midlands. So does University of Birmingham. So does University College. So there wasn't even a narrative for something that not only were the staff really bought into and their commitment to doing their very best for their students because they were for Birmingham, but there wasn't a narrative and a way of capturing that and rewarding that and recognizing that to further empower and reward our colleagues. So, the question then for me, as a few months in, is how do I bring a fresh impetus to define a future, given all that context about what's going on in the sector, so that there is a clear ambition, there is clarity on what the university is about, its definitions, its mission and vision, and that ultimately that strategy would help force a change in culture. Now, I don't know how much of a force that is, but help begin to drive, I suppose is the right word, a change in culture. And it's taken us 10 months. And my colleague here, Joe Devo, my director of marketing and comms, very much part of that drive. So just to recognize here. So how do you go about doing this? After the first round of discussions, understanding the context of the university, getting a feel for it myself, I went out again and said, right, we're going to build a new strategy. And it's going to be built bottom up. And I was absolutely clear, imperative, that it must be built bottom up. Not from the Vice-Chancellor, not from the executive team, not from the middle management. It was going to be built by colleagues, by our students, alumni, and our stakeholders, public and private. So it had to be built that way in the full sense. I also said that the way we go about doing this would be void of any management in that conversation. I took myself completely out of the conversations, took my executive team out of conversations, and took line managers of groups out of those conversations. I genuinely wanted to hear the ambitions and thoughts of colleagues, to be radical if they wanted to criticize if they wanted to, but it was an opportunity to get really something built bottom up. And for me, ultimately, this approach, for me in particular, was very much about giving colleagues ownership, feeling empowered and feeling part of a vision, a collective vision. Having developed it, there is an element of accountability that begins to come to the fore. We have to define purpose, but also, most importantly, for me as the executive lead or the Vice-Chancellor, trust. I had to begin to build trust. As I said earlier on, there was a big disjoint between the executive and the senior management and colleagues. So in rebuilding that trust, this was also one way of doing it. As I've said, and I genuinely believe this, if colleagues are not bought into your mission, there's nothing you can do to land where you want to get to. So, how did we go about doing this? This is where we went through a process and SOMS Consulting were involved. And we kind of co-created the way we went about doing this. I had some thoughts, SOMS had some thoughts, but we were very clear that we wanted this really to be a listening approach. Colleagues being fed in with slight framing of what the discussions were going to be about. And we began this in phases. Over 600 plus staff engaged in face-to-face sessions. At some point, SOMS Consulting were kind of based at the university because it took a few months to get through all this. But it allowed colleagues to discuss. Not only was that for staff, students, alumni, stakeholders as well. Having got all of that information, we then went back again to say, this is what you've said. what elements of this are worth delving into in a bit more detail? So this is very much about ownership, making sure that colleagues feel that they own this. They haven't just said this and it's been put to one side, as usually happens with management, they say. So we're going back to say, this is what we've done, this is what you've said, which are the areas within this context would we want to perhaps emphasize a lot more on? And that resulted in more detailed workshops to unpick some of these grand ideas or grand thoughts. And having then got to a stage where we had a kind of a skeleton of what the strategy was going to look like, we then went back to sense check one last time. The message here, from my point of view, and why I was really keen to do this, is about building trust again. Making sure that you were responding and responsive to what colleagues were saying. I was putting to bed all those comments like, well, I've done this before and nothing ever happens. And ultimately, getting sure that people feel that they have bought into this and believe in this. Yesterday, we launched a strategy. Rooted in Birmingham, reaching beyond is the strapline. This very much speaks to the history of the institution. Has been in Birmingham for 180 years and provided skills in that region for this long. It speaks to that language of the University for Birmingham. And what this strategy begins to do is to put a narrative around that University for Birmingham concept. To be rooted in Birmingham means we're going to be proud and we're going to own that anchor institution that we have been. Yes, we want to reach beyond, as does the city, but we are very much tied into that city. The next thing that came out, and I'm going to come back to culture, is to be an exemplar anchor institution. The key word here for me is exemplar, because it begins to speak about excellence in what we do and about taking pride in the fact that we are going to be excellent in what we do. It ultimately means for the university that we need to engage more in our region. And that means that every colleague who has fed into this knows that they're going to be needing to do a lot more with the third sector, private sector, with businesses. In the end, this kind of essentially captures what we ended up with. And I'm just going to speak to one space and then perhaps I'll soon slightly wrap up. The very first pillar of developing talent for tomorrow. Collectively, colleagues said our number one objective should be employability. Then I say to colleagues, our graduate employability rate is only 74%. If we are going to be that exemplar, 74% is not good enough. Therefore, the way we work, the way we hold each other to account, the way we begin to think about performance management becomes part of this new strategy. Are the courses fit for purpose? We spoke about academic reviews. That's going to have to take place again. Are those who contribute to teaching the right constituents of the teaching staff? Do they have to have a PhD? And I'm saying no, they don't. We want more practitioners in the classroom. We want contemporary skills that are being used in industry, aligned with the theoretical knowledge that academics hold, to give students the best opportunities to get in the jobs they want. That is our number one mission. Therefore, the way we work will have to change. And the way we engage with each other within the institution has to change. We need to not work in silos anymore. Academics need to work with the careers team, the enterprise unit, because we need businesses to come back into the university to allow students to have live projects, short-term placements, etc., etc. It begins to change the narrative. It's not me saying this, and I keep reminding my colleagues as I go out to bring this to life, this is what we all decided we want to do. And to achieve this, we need also to hold each other to account. Creating knowledge for good, speaking about our research, we have collectively said our research would first and foremost focus on the city. There are hundreds of problems in Birmingham, in any city. Inequalities in education, inequalities in healthcare, nutrition. There are lots of problems in this. There are a lot of societal problems to address. Yes, we want to work with the European Union. Yes, we want to bring in those grants. But first and foremost, we have collectively agreed that to be that exemplar anchor institution, our first priority will be to focus research in solving problems in the city and region. So here again is going to be a change in culture, a change in the way of working, and a change in expectation. I could go on, but I do want to have some time for questions. But essentially, I hope, what I've shown is, I hope, how culture and strategy are absolutely aligned. But culture, for me, is the most important thing. Colleagues need to feel, staff need to feel that they buy into a vision, they buy into a purpose. I was lucky in the fact that colleagues very much believed that they were for Birmingham. What they couldn't put around that was the narrative of what it actually meant. And now it's no surprise that as we've taken soundings, as we've consulted, what has come up is a clear narrative around what we want to do, but also a clear understanding that our culture, the way we performance management, the way we hold each other to account, also has to change to allow us to deliver on this. As I make this live, so I'm having sessions with my colleagues, suddenly there's a realization that change is imminent. And yes, we want this, but perhaps they thought that would just go back onto the shelf. But this is going to be live now. And now the discussions about, the changes required begins to raise its own anxiety. So yes, we've been through a process to develop this. Right now, it's time to begin to think about the operationalization of this, the transformation activities required, the transformation team that has to be built up to drive several of these initiatives. And suddenly I can see anxiety. Ooh. So that's the next phase of a cultural management that I'm going to have to tackle. I don't know what the answer is to that, but that's where I've got to. So I hope it's useful. I'm not an expert in culture and strategy, but I just thought I would share a journey, and I hope that's been of use.
Yeah, we've got time for questions.
Thank you. Yep. Thank you very much for that. It was really interesting. So I'm from the University of Manchester. Okay. We're currently in the kind of listening, consultation phase, developing our new strategy. We're taking I'm on now. I don't know if everyone.
Well,
you heard my introduction. So I guess we're taking an ever so slightly different approach. We are listening to our community, but that's been led by university leadership. So I guess I'm interested in, if you went back 13 months and did this a different way, and you led this, how different would the strategy look, do you think? What's surprised you that's come out from that bottom-up approach?
Thank you. I think the context in this was that in the context where the senior management were not thought highly of, and a culture where colleagues were disempowered and the voice of colleagues were not being listened to. For me, it was imperative that there was no senior leadership team present, because that's the only way colleagues will feel they can speak openly, and even their line managers I didn't want present. Because I really wanted colleagues to feel, right, I can now speak. I can speak, get things off my chest, think about the future. In a different context, it again depends on the university and the culture. there might be reasons to have senior leadership there, but I always feel that colleagues are a bit kind of cagey when leadership is present. And if you really want to hear and you really want the voice to be out, to be loud, best stay away. Sometimes, you can color things, and you might not know you're doing it, but you can put a slight lens on a discussion by just making 2 or 3 comments that suddenly, the discussion slightly moves away from perhaps where you want it to be. So I took the view, in consultation with SOMS and my colleagues, let's just step away. Given that context that, senior team, or you're just going to be another one of them. So I had to build that trust, and the best way was to step completely out. And perhaps in the end, whether I was there or not, the same thing will come out, I don't know. But I think for my colleagues and for the university at that time, it was best I stepped out.
Thank you very much. Great presentation, thank you. So what you just described there in any other industry could reasonably be described as a brand positioning exercise. So was that a conscious decision not to frame it as that, or to position it as a strategy exercise? And what was your thinking?
Thank you. So, we're doing a brand exercise right now. So this is very much about strategy, very much thinking about the future. I've only put a slide up, but there's a lot behind it. It's very much about thinking 2030, thinking about the pedagogy, thinking about the way we should be teaching by 2030. Also thinking about how the infrastructure facilitates that. Some of my faculties, there's nursing, there's midwifery, there's a lot of practice-based approach, which in some of my other faculties they're very much kind of slides and so forth. But if we are to get to be kind of number one for employability, that has to change. And therefore, the kind of behind all of this is, how do we bring more practice into the classroom? Students can pick up so much online. Coming to a lecture can be quite boring now. So how do we change our pedagogy across all subject areas to bring more practice in, so that ultimately, the students leave straight into graduate employment? So this isn't a branding exercise. The branding exercise will be part of this, and that's Joe's responsibility. But this was very much about 2030. Who do we want to be? How do we want to be perceived? And what do we want to deliver for our students? And beneath all of this is also ensuring equitable outcomes for all students. We have an awarding gap, which is unacceptable. And I have been challenging my colleagues, and it's difficult. But, if we want to achieve what we've set out to achieve, and as a clear line in our strategy, equitable outcomes for all students. Everybody signed up to that. Staff have said, we need to change this. And for me, that's the first win, because they accept that we need to change. So it's not quite a brand exercise, but yeah, that I've left to Joe, but there's a lot more detail behind this. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, Daphne Barker, Strategic Projects at Lancaster University. Thanks for the talk, it's very inspirational. First of all, I wholeheartedly agree with everything that you're saying. It's so important to change things, to do them from bottom up. My question is, have you got anything in place so that you can assess the difference in doing things bottom up, so that if something happens and the leadership changes, that it doesn't just go back to the way it was before? Because I think this is something that's very important to continue and to be a very big part of the future.
I agree, completely agree. So, this has all been signed off by the board. So this is set in stone now. And out of all of this will be particular strategies, research, knowledge exchange, infrastructure, IT. But the journey's been set. So, I'm not saying I'm leaving. But if I was to move on, or somebody else was to come in, the strategy is not about me, and it's not about any any executive leader. It's a strategy that's been built by everyone in the institution. The question is, my role is to drive that through. And any executive leader within the university is going to be driving that. We can't suddenly change path now. The only reason why we might want to change path, clearly we'll review this in 3 years' time, are cost implications. We have big plans for IT infrastructure in the way we want to teach. Suddenly, if things become far too expensive, particularly just, several prices are now going up, even cloud computing is going up. So it's those types of uncontrollable events that might make some change in the current trajectory. But the strategy shouldn't be dependent on the senior leadership team. It should be an institutional strategy that's been collectively agreed by staff, by exec, and by the board, who ultimately have responsibility for this. Thank you.
Thank you. It's Claudia from the University of Sussex. We are soon to publish our new strategy, Sussex 2035. My question is about the balance that's coming out of your strategy between improving business as usual and genuine new strategic change. So I was just wondering what sort of, how much of it that's coming out of yours is really transformational, strategic, new activity, and how much of it is just getting the fabric right?
Perfect. Thank you. So continuous improvement is something that always has to carry on. And for example, change in IT infrastructure for teaching, that's going to be transformational. That's going to be new. But at the same time, it's a balance, a complete balance. And it's also about timing and the transformation support we get. When do you transition from business as usual to something that's very new? And that has significant cost implications and risk. Teaching, for example, is going to be very different. In certain areas where we have a lot of practice, that will carry on. But some other areas, like a business school, they will have to learn new ways of doing. And they will have to learn and change the way they recruit. You have to have a PhD. No, you don't, actually. No, so there are going to be really big transformational things that will happen. The estate will have to transform. And again, it's based on the need of our students and the pedagogy. So those are going to be kind of big transformational things. Where you can say it's kind of a refocus is maybe on research, because the research infrastructure already exists, but we're going to be pivoting more to solving local problems as opposed to wanting to do work all over the place. So that's more about tweaking than something that's quite revolutionary. So it's a balance, and it very much depends again on your journey and what your university wants to get out of particular aspects of the institution. If it's IT, that's definitely going to be transformational. If it's estate, that's transformational. Pedagogy can be, depending on, as I've outlined, but some other bits are just tweaking and making sure it's right.
Thank you very much. That was very inspirational. You talked about the involvement of the students in the original development of the strategy. How will you keep them involved? What are your plans to keep them more than just now the passive recipients of the changes?
Yeah, thank you. And I think this is absolutely important. I mean, the student voice is now significantly enhanced. I meet course reps myself. I've really empowered them, and I've made sure that their attendance at the right committees is assured, because it hasn't necessarily always been that way in the past. And it's about my engagement with the Students' Union, but also with students. And the ethos around this strategy is students first. That's the way I lead. I've made that very clear for me, decisions are easy when you think about your students and what's best for them. There are hard decisions to be made, but you're very clear. If it's not of benefit to the students, then that can wait. So the student voice will be definitely is empowered, but the ethos behind the whole thing is about students first.
Hi, David. Back here. Really interesting. Thanks so much for sharing. You spoke a lot about trust.
Yes.
Which I think we'd all agree is important. But my question is about the how. Did you have a strategic view, have a roadmap of interventions you knew we needed to make? Is it about doing the right thing every day? But also, did you have to differentiate it by the different communities and staff groups? Did they expect different things from you to develop that trust?
Thank you. Thank you. Good question. I didn't differentiate. I've got one community, and this is very much about visibility, about responding, about being open and transparent, and having difficult conversations openly, agreeing what's going to be done, and actually enacting it. And it's taken a while to build that trust. I think I'm nearly there. I still have problems with the UCU. but it's been very clear and open. And you have to just keep drip feeding on this. I speak about plans to do X and Y, and I'm very clear very early on. I provide the rationale for why it is in open town halls, and I take all the questions openly and respond accordingly. And I think once colleagues can see you acting on what you've said, but also where you've made decisions that they don't necessarily agree with, being there to actually front it up and explain why is also significantly important. I'm one of those people who just likes to get around. I don't sit in the office very, very much. I like to go around and just say hello and keep talking to people and be really there with them, with my staff. And that's how, I didn't have a plan on how I'll do it. I just knew I had to just build trust of everybody. And that's really by the way I behave, by the way my senior team behaves, and by the way we communicate and engage with staff. And that's how building trust in that way. There's no plan. I'm not an expert. I just do what I think needs to be done.
Hi, I'm Alex from the University of Oxford. Firstly, I really admire the clarity and simplicity of your vision and the process that you use to get to it. It's really, really compelling. So I'm coordinating the strategic planning process at Oxford at the moment, and I'm constantly trying to think about how I can bring together sort of inside-out view of what we want to be, whether that's from top-down or bottom-up, trying to sort of bring that together, and the outside-in view of what the future is that we're planning for, and what the world needs from Oxford, I suppose. I'm curious to understand how you brought the sort of outside in, that sort of external context analysis into this.
Yeah.
Did you sort of seed those discussion groups with an understanding of that context, or
Yes.
use it to sense check? How did you bring that in?
Thank you. So that was done with SOMS. So there was some contextualization that was brought into the engagement sessions with staff. And without overwhelming colleagues with too much information, but just so that they had an awareness of what was going on within the sector, and also within the economy. So that was very much SOM's contribution to helping manage that engagement. So, but that's one view of the external context. I was very keen also to hear from external stakeholders, where students will end up, where the city council and how we engage with them. And that really was very insightful, more so than I thought it would be. And we had, 4 or 5 sessions, big workshops. We invited breakfast sessions. And really, when you hear what the external stakeholders think of you and think of your failings, it hurts. But it sinks. It does sink in, and you think, right, okay, that's a perception, and that's something that needs to be changed. How you do that and how that feeds into the overall plans is absolutely important. So yes, there's the contextual part which SOM's put in, but there's also the stakeholders where that voice is powerful, because what you think is not what actually people think outside. Okay.
That was tremendous, David. Really, really powerful insights, some very special lessons for us all to take away from that. So please, could you join me in thanking Professor David and Bart?